Dobar dan i dobrodošli u treću specijalnu epizodu Radarovog podkasta koji se bavi sad nekim širim geopolitičkim implikacijama ovog problema sa litijumom o kome pričamo već iz epizode u epizodu i koji je negde, čini mi se, neka neuralgična tema našeg društva trenutno, ali možda i šire, možda i globalno. Zbog toga se nalazimo na Univerzitetu u Gracu, gde imamo zadovoljstvo da pričamo sa doktorom Florijanom Biberom. Welcome to Radar Podcast and thank you for speaking to us.
Well, thanks for having me on your program.
Can you please make a short introduction? A lot of our viewers know you, but about your academic background and what made you interested in the Balkans?
Well, I'm originally from Luxembourg. I studied in the US, Austria, and Hungary at Central European University as well, and became interested in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s during the wars. Made friends, colleagues there, traveled to Serbia, to Croatia, later to Bosnia, and that kept me fascinated, interested for the last, more than 25 years. I've been researching it and then living in Serbia and Bosnia and teaching this in different universities, and now I've been in Austria in Graz for the last 15 years, here a professor for Southeast European history and politics at the Center for Southeast European Studies.
Is it important to understand the processes that are happening in Southeastern Europe right now, and how are they, in your opinion, connected to the wider European and then world politics?
Well, I mean, in a certain way, what is happening in Southeastern Europe is linked to global development. So in that sense, it's part of a larger trend. In the 90s, we had the rise of nationalism and violent nationalism in Southeastern Europe, but again, it was not unique. It was expressing itself in a very violent way in Yugoslavia because of the nature of the state and a number of specific factors, but these were wider trends. And also again now, the rise of authoritarianism, like we've seen in Serbia over the last decade and more, is part of a global trend. It has manifestations in neighboring countries like Hungary or other regional countries like Turkey, but it's also part of a global trend. So in that sense, what is happening in the region is not unique and not detached, but it's part of global trends. But then also I would say there are certain specific features because Southeastern Europe, especially the Western Balkans, are not in the European Union, and that has given it a space for global actors to become more involved in those countries. So in a certain way, the global competition we're seeing between China, Russia, the EU, and the US, we see particularly strongly manifested in the Western Balkans as a region which is close to the EU but not in the European Union.
So could you, in your wildest dreams, imagine the same type of local atavisms and nationalisms now dividing Britain from European Union and dividing basically America in half? And was the Yugoslavia avant-garde in that sense, predictions of things to come? Because I'm not a historian, but I couldn't have predicted that.
Certainly, in the 90s, people thought the Yugoslavs are the crazy nationalists, and we Europeans, quote unquote, are not going to do that. Of course, now you have a situation where in Austria, the largest political party in opinion polls is the far-right Freedom Party. In Germany, we've had regional elections where a far-right party is the strongest party in two German states. We had a Trump presidency, and we have Trump as a candidate for another US presidency. We had Brexit. I mean, these are ethno-nationalist, authoritarian political parties and leaders who've become strong in West European countries where people said, well, this authoritarianism, this extreme nationalism, this happens in the Balkans. This doesn't happen with us. And of course, you see no country is immune to it. Some countries are more vulnerable because there are antagonisms these parties can play on, and some countries are vulnerable because of weak institutions, economic crisis, but it doesn't mean that others cannot catch this disease in a certain way. And so in a certain way, yes, Yugoslavia was avant-garde in 2 decades ahead of time.
And now we have this really crazy situation in Serbia where we have the deposits of lithium, and we have this extremely aggressive corporation called Rio Tinto. We had major protests 2 years ago, and a majority of people said no, and our government said, okay, we will not make this deal, and actually it was ratified. And now, because it's a more totalitarian society, this decision was I don't know, discarded by the Supreme Court, probably after one call from Vučić, and they're continuing very aggressively actually to do this Jadar project, which is on fertile land, and it would cause, like majority of scientists in the world that are dealing with these issues concluded that it would cause irreversible damage.
Sure, it did, of course.
The only place we actually looked for any kind of empathy and allies is the EU,
yeah.
And then the answer we got from EU was Olafa Šolca and Macron publicly supporting Vučić.
Yeah.
What to do now?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is, I mean, I share your frustration. I think the EU made a big mistake to support this project enthusiastically. I mean, I think it's, again, it's supported, it's following a logic which has nothing to do with Serbia, right? So it's a logic which came about to a large degree because of during the COVID years, the idea of nearshoring, the idea of creating European economic self-sustainability separate from China. And so, yes, while they're big shareholders, it's a multinational corporation. Rio Tinto is nobody's company. I mean, it doesn't have a national identity. People often call it Anglo-Australian. That's its origin, but it's a multinational corporation. It will do business. It will do business how and whenever it suits it. But of course, it's not a Chinese company which operates like Chinese-owned companies which operate elsewhere, like in Serbia and Smederevo and Bor and so on. And so it will sell its lithium to European car makers. And this is why Germany is behind it, because, again, Germany also supported Viktor Orban for many years because the car industry is doing good business in Hungary. It's working. And that's, in the end, this is where you'll win elections. I mean, national politicians like Angela Merkel, she is under pressure she was under pressure in local elections, state elections in Germany, where their fellow conservatives are running. And if the car industry does well, they win elections in Baden-Württemberg and in Bayern and in other places. And, she's able to stay in power. And the same with Scholz, so in a certain way, he wins elections in Germany. And if German car makers are happy and all of the industry is connected with it, then, of course, this will help his government. And so there's the economic self-interest, and then there's the logic of, we want to be less dependent on China. All of this means that basically Serbia is very useful for that, because it helps both support domestic industry and support this kind of independence from economic influence from China. And you ignore the fact, or you convince yourself that the problems are not as bad. So it's harder to convince yourself if you're green in Germany, because you're supposed to care about environment. Of course, you care more about environment in your own country, but you should be more, let's say, transnational in your conviction. But then maybe you tell yourself, well, it helps to reduce the Chinese influence, maybe also in Serbia. And then there's also this whole narrative, which I think is a mistake, but I'm not saying that people don't believe it, that it will help, attach Serbia to the West. This is what you saw in a lot of Western reporting about Macron's visit, but also Scholz's visit, to say, well, it kind of links Serbia closer to the West, and, it detaches it from Russia and China. I think it's completely wrong.
It's completely wrong.
It doesn't make any sense.
Every intellectual I know who has been an avid supporter of EU for our entire lives, we risked everything, basically fighting every regime from Milosevic to Vučić. We are extremely skeptical now. Because we have no reason not to be. It's like this dream that we were living, and we were sort of in a coma for 12 years, and we woke up and we realized, okay, but they have been supporting him fully for 12 years, knowing who he is. What the hell happened to this European dream that we actually bought, and we thought it was real? And I'm talking about Europe of values, of values derived from Enlightenment and to what created the European Union today, not just as economic union. So there have been major shifts. And after the Yugoslav wars and after the 5th of October and the fall of Milosevic, we had a short period of democracy. And we were always looking up to Europe. At least some of people in Serbia were trying to get the society to be more open and more democratic, and so on. And Europe basically failed to do that, and now I'm thinking back, and I'm going back to 2012, and I'm asking myself, was I stupid to believe that? Because they actively supported Vučić, who was the third man in a party of a convicted war criminal, and on YouTube. You have a clip of Vučić saying that Serbia should kill 100 Muslims for one Serb, and that was few days after or before Srebrenica genocide. So would this man have a chance of political career in any of the Western European countries with that history?
I mean, of course, to the second question, I mean, there are a few countries where somebody has been, where you have the legacy of the 90s. So in a certain way, there isn't an equivalent. But of course, we have politicians in a number of EU countries on the far right, but they're far right politicians, right? They're extremists who would hold, or they wouldn't state it. I mean, they would not state, we're going to kill 100 Muslims. Of course, this was stated in the context of a war. So I think you wouldn't have you have plenty of anti-Muslim politicians in Western Europe and Central Europe. They wouldn't say it. They would send messages which say a similar thing.
But
now,
would their careers be over
if they would say that? I think their career probably would be over. And certainly they would not be seen as welcome by many others because that's a taboo, that's going too far. I think the problem with the EU's support for Vučić, at least in the initial phases, was that they believed, wrongly of course, that he changed, that he wasn't that man, as he said in 96 or 95, those horrific statements. So they thought that he was going to be different 10 years or 15 years later. And also, I think then there's also some stereotypes about the Balkans. I mean, they also feel like, well, this is, Balkan politics is different than European politics. I think this image is still very strong, not among everybody. I think EU is complicated and there are different actors. But I remember a backroom conversation with back then Foreign Minister Sebastian Kurz, the Austrian later Chancellor, who, when pushed why he was not more critical about Vučić, said, well, he just does what a Balkan politician does, So this was his image, that Vučić is just a regular, quote-unquote, Balkan politician, but not understanding that Vučić is not the same as, the predecessors in the 2000s, and that he is much more systematically destroying democracy.
But that, from the start, that means that there is a different set of standards.
The EU is as good and as bad as its, member states, its parties and politicians, right? So when you were asking, was it the wrong dream? I would say no. I mean, I had the same dream, and many people did, that this was a value-based community within and outside. And it still is to some degree. It's much less than I would hope it to be, much less than I would hope it to be when it comes to the Western Balkans or to Serbia. It missed a lot of opportunities. It made bad choices, but it's not the EU, but it's individual leaders, individual politicians. It's Angela Merkel in her support for Aleksandra Vučić. It's the Austrian politicians over the years who've supported it for whatever. And then there are multiple reasons: naivete, pragmatism, economic interest, geopolitical interests, blindness. So it's not that there is one master plan to say we want Vučić or we want autocrats. It's much more that we have on the side of the Serbian president somebody who knows exactly how to maneuver and how to manipulate these European leaders who, and I think this is the big important thing, the European Union has been distracted. I would say after 2008, we have the economic crisis, which really took all the attention of the EU for a few years. Then we have the Eurozone crisis, which takes all the attention with Greece nearly dropping out of the European Union in 2012. We have the so-called migration crisis in 2015. We have Brexit in 2016, the same year Trump comes to power. We have 2020 COVID. We have 2022 Ukraine. So the last 15 years or 16 years have been a period of nearly constant crisis. And crises which in many ways were not caused by the EU, but were imported, so to speak. And that has distracted the EU from the values. And when it comes to the Western Balkans, it distracted it from the region to say, well, there's no problem. There's no serious problem. There's no war, there's no fighting, there is no big problem, so we can ignore it because we have other problems to solve. Now, of course, I'm not saying this is the right approach. I think with a little bit more investment and a little bit more clarity over the years, the EU could have achieved a lot more and could have avoided being in a situation where it might be confronted with new crises. So I don't say it's a good policy, but I think this distraction explains a lot of why the EU and many of its leaders have been neglecting the region, and it's been kind of going on a, standby modus. And that's been, I think, and, there are, I think, some politicians in the region, and Vučić is the best example, are very good at reading these global trends and these shifting power dynamics.
He's been very good at that. I mean, but also I mentioned one incident. I mentioned that speech he gave about 100 Muslims, but actually it's like one thing. By 2012, he was an adult human being with a history of, I wouldn't call it even right wing, with blood on his hands, with actual blood on his hands. So I can't quite buy the idea that most of the Western leaders were so naive not to read history and not to understand what kind of creature they would support in pushing him towards like presidency and absolutism, which was completely foreseeable. I mean, we were writing about that and back in the day, and because in previous government there were many problems, but I think we had leverage. So we could actually push them, and European Union could push them, and then the States and Russia in some directions. But here with Vučić, democracy basically ended. So now it seems really cynical to hear about the ideas of democracy, open society, freedoms, etc. from say Olafa Šolca or Macron, who have their crisis back home, and then they come to Serbia and support this guy after 12 years of completely devastating civil society in Serbia. So what was the calculus? I cannot imagine they were so naive. Did they perceive Serbia should be a colony and deserves no better than that back then, or was it an evolving process? Because now we have, with this lithium crisis, there was a German minister, Francesca Brandner, and she said Germany will not dig lithium until the technology is advanced enough to take care of ecological consequences, but they support digging lithium in Serbia. So that's basically a status of colony. And of course there was a huge amount of guilt on behalf of Serbian people who voted for Vučić, but only until like the second election, because after that there were no free elections in Serbia.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think first of all, I believe greatly in naivete of people and of political leaders as well. I think they don't think long term very often, and they don't understand. They don't know, and so I don't think that they knew Vučić in the sense of that they knew the dangers. I think, and we know in 2008, 2009, when the SNS was established, there was a lot of support from embassies at the time, and I think their calculation was very clear. They had seen the Radical Party become the strongest party in the 2000s, stronger than DS, and always threatening the balance, that the government was always fragile. The DOS governments, DS governments, DSS coalitions, they were always fragile, and so they saw, well, here's a party which breaks away from the radical party, which is speaking European talk. It talks about EU integration and, distances itself in a very limited way, but somehow, not just about enough from the radical party. And that seemed like a good deal at the time to say, well, let's support them because that can create a more normal political environment in Serbia where you don't have, everybody has to be on one side in coalition and then you have the others who threaten democracy, right? So they seem, well, the logic, the assumption back then, this was before the rise of far-right parties around Europe and elsewhere, was like, well, the normal way is that a country has mainstream parties, conservative social democrats, and they're all pro-European. This is what happened in Croatia. HDZ, from Tudjman's nationalist authoritarian, became more conservative, more moderately kind of European Christian Democrats. So, they become pro-European, and then they pursue integration, and then the country joins, and these countries become normal political parties. This was the logic. And then the logic was the same will happen with the SNS, that it will become like the Serbian, HDZ, so to speak, the party which is a conservative party, which might be nationalist, but it wants to join the European Union, it will do those things. And then in 2012, there were a couple of things which came together. It was the frustration with Boris Tadic, it was the frustration with him not delivering on some things, it was frustration with Vuk Jeremić's constant campaigning about Kosovo. And they said, well, maybe, and this is always the logic, that the nationalists can solve the national questions. Just like the social democrats can do difficult, we saw this in the 90s, difficult issues when it came to dealing with labor issues, economic reform, because nobody on the left is going to challenge them.
Only Nixon could go to China.
Exactly. And so only Vučić could go to Pristina or could solve the issue with Kosovo. This was the logic.
But
right?
He was lying to them.
Well, of course, but he was very good at lying to them. Because the Brussels agreement was signed, when he was deputy prime minister. So the signal was, aha, things were stuck in the technical talks with Tadic. Vučić comes in, Dačić, switches sides to Vučić. All of a sudden, you have the Brussels agreement. It looked very good, So I don't blame leaders in 2012, 2013, and even 2014 of thinking Vučić might deliver on Kosovo and then become more normal in a certain way, nor help normalize Serbia, a country where these issues are resolved, conservative party is in power, you have opposition, and that kind of can become a normal democracy. But then they did not understand that Vučić was what Vučić was doing once he was in power, because he was also, let's not forget when when SNS was established, it was first Nikolić, Vučić took a second row, and then Nikolić won the presidency, it wasn't Vučić. So he seemed much more under control. He didn't seem so powerful in 2012, 2004, in those years. So I remember talking to many people in Serbia at the time. From, let's say, the civil society, people, many of them were also hopeful about Vučić. I remember, not everybody, but I do remember talking to quite a few people in Serbia who were at the time believing that Vučić could actually do difficult things and deliver. I'm not going to say any names, but I think that I was more skeptical than they were. But I remember discussing with them, and they were like, no, he will do the right things. But I remember similar conversations when I was giving advice to Freedom House many years ago, speaking to the Russia expert. It must have been 2001, 2002, and he was saying, Putin is great because he's not because he's what he's today, but he's going to establish functioning institutions, rule of law. And I was like, well, I don't think so. But he was convinced about that. So, in certain ways with Vučić was similar in those first years where where yes, it might be naive, but I think he gave enough reasons that you could fool yourself or believe it, especially if you're an outsider, especially if you're far away, you're not following the details. I remember this exhibition which SNS organized, I think this was 2014, about, where they showed critical articles about Vučić in a way to say, well, look, we're allowing for criticism, but at the same time, they're kind of putting them on a stage and also kind of criticizing them. That was already this is not what a democratic government does. But this is something which if you're observing things. But if you're Angela Merkel, overall, he's talking with Kosovo, they're signing agreements, He seems to be moving in the right direction. He is willing to do, EU integration. So, I'm not justifying them because I was critical at the time, but I see why people could be fooled. And then once you're part of that, once you're, it's the old metaphor of the put a frog and not in boiling water, but you turn up the heat a little bit. So every year it's been getting worse. So it's not, Vučić didn't have a coup. He didn't say, and now everything is undemocratic, but he's been
It was a process.
every year a little bit more, right?
But it was exponential.
Absolutely, and it's been getting worse. But this gradual process makes it easier to ignore because it's not you can't say when did Serbia stop being a democracy, right? You cannot say there's an exact year. You can say it's a gradual process, and then before you notice, you realize you have no more free elections, you have no more, freedoms of criticizing the government because you're going to be slandered, attacked, and so on. So it's been getting worse, but it's this gradual process.
But there were voices on the ground that were telling, like, if you give power to this coalition of war criminals and people with that kind of past, there'll be no turning back. So 2012 is that for me. And also with Kosovo, do you think a huge mistake has been made? Because all the focus has been on Kosovo and this project of creating this independent state, which I thought was the solution back then. But now, fast forward so many years after that, it seems Serbia was sacrificed and completely destroyed as a society in order to check that box of finishing the Kosovo project. And in Kosovo now we have this extreme nationalist who is even more extreme than Vučić in some ways, with Kurti, and he wants to make an ethnically clean Kosovo state. The little Serbs that are left are living under horrific conditions, and he wants to purge them, basically, and Europe is insisting to round this up, and in the meantime Serbia has deteriorated to a point where I don't see clear ways of restoring democracy.
Well, I don't think. First of all, I have. There are lots of things to be critical about Albin Kurti and his government. I don't think he's trying to ethnically cleanse Kosovo or even not to expel any Serbs from Kosovo. I think he's pursuing a very stubborn and very wrong policy and confront how he deals with Kosovo Serbs. He's pushing them in the arms of Vučić because he's offering them nothing in return. I think I wouldn't call it ethnic cleansing, and I wouldn't call it. I think even his policies are not even extreme nationalist. I think they're more very stubborn, trying to establish the sovereignty of Kosovo and all its territory against, in a very uncompromising and very dogmatic way. And he's a dogmatist in many ways. So I would consider him rather a dogmatist than a radical. He's got a radical streak as well, that's sure. But, in many ways, when the independence of Kosovo was always a tricky issue, and it remains until today. I cannot imagine, and I haven't heard anybody offering a good alternative. And I think this is part of the debate in Serbia. I remember even when I was living in Serbia from 2001 till 2006, when the Kosovo discussion was beginning, right around the time when Prime Minister Đinđić was assassinated. But again, nobody had a good alternative offer of how to keep this territory with 2 million Albanians in Serbia, how that would look like.
I don't think that would be possible.
Exactly.
But Đinđić was suggesting the split.
Yeah, although this was just one of the ideas, it was never that formulated. The problem, of course, of the split would have always been that most Serbs live south of the Ibar River, and they would have been not part of the split. And they probably would have been in a worse position if there had been a split than if there hadn't been a split, because they would be a smaller minority in a more self-perceived homogeneous Kosovo. So I don't think that would have really helped the majority of Serbs in Kosovo. I think the problem was really, I think there was a real opportunity missed I would say, of Tadić and his government when they won elections in 2008. And it's, to me, still a bit of a mystery, because they won against Koštunica with a very clear message that Europe is more important than Kosovo. That was like the message, because Koštunica offered the alternative, which was one of saying, Kosovo is more important than Europe. And then he appoints Vuk Jeremić and goes into this, making Kosovo the central part of his foreign policy.
But you can't believe how stubborn and stupid this man is. I actually thought there was a plan and there was an idea, and then later when you see him like bare now without power, he still clings to these ideas. I thought it was just a PR campaign, but no, they actually believed that. A lot of them actually believed that.
Yeah, and this was, I think, this was a big mistake, because they made it a lot easier for somebody like Vučić to take on, because, the foreign policy of Vučić and Jeremić, is not that different, at least in the first years. Trying to build this non-aligned, going to Pacific Islands, and, Marko Đurić does it, but Jeremić did it as well 15 years ago. So in that sense, I think that was a strategic mistake of saying, Serbia, nobody asked that, Tadić or Jeremić would recognize Kosovo, but you could just put it off the agenda. You could say, let's move on. We disagree with the European Union. We have a different interpretation, but we're not going to go into this campaigning about it. Which, in the end, what did it give to Serbia? Nothing. This campaigning. Okay, then oh great. Tuvalu stopped recognizing Kosovo. It's all fake, because who cares?
It keeps us in the past. It keeps that nationalist narrative alive, and it keeps this issue unresolved so many decades after. I was always talking about France and Germany, about after the Second World War, or even worse. You have Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and two atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, and then what would happen in Japan in the 60s or 70s if that kind of rhetoric and that kind of ideology was pursued.
Well, but I think this is exactly the big difference. Germany and Japan were countries which were defeated in war, occupied, and there was a rupture, right? There was the people who were responsible for the wars were put on trial in Tokyo and Nuremberg. The parties were banned. There was a clear...
Well, in Tokyo...
the parties were banned.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Also in Germany... Also, of course, Hirohito remained emperor. In Germany, of course, lots of people returned to power very soon after. But there was a clear break. At some point, even for a few years, but it was a clear break. And again, I wouldn't compare the position of Serbia with that of Germany or Japan. I think, I do believe in the 90s, the main responsibility for the wars lay with Slobodan Milošević and the wars, but it wasn't the same.
He had an ideal partner in Tudjman.
Exactly, he had partners who also were responsible. In the case of Germany and Japan, the sole responsibility for the war is with Japan and Germany, which made it easier in a certain way to accept that. And the problem is in the Yugoslav case, to say this, yes, Milošević is the prime culprit, but he had partners, makes it a more complicated story. And of course, after 2000, there was no break. There was the parties, the same people were never gone completely. Neither in Croatia, HDZ lost in 2000, but they came back 3 years later, and they were never, they were not far. Nobody talked about banning the party or so. In Serbia, SPS, yes, they collapsed, but the same people were there, and the radicals the same. So in a certain way, you didn't have this break, and so you didn't have this saying what the way the wars were fought and what they were fought for was fundamentally wrong. This was never said
in some circles.
Of course, but that was said also during the 90s.
Yeah.
In those circles, but these circles weren't able to move out and to change society, and even the even when the whole question of cooperation with the International Criminal Tribunal it was always already by, and I think this was a mistake already of the Đinđić government. It was always framed as, is the price right? We need to do it because we get. We get credits, crazy. We get EU, but it was never said we do it because these are criminals.
Yes,
these are thugs. They kill women, they kill children. We want to have nothing to do with them. So like
Gigi tried that. Actually, he released that video of the killed Albanians in that truck and everything, and he sort of tried to move towards that direction. But I agree with you, that was
this was, I think, a big opportunity missed, because then basically the debate was just, is the price right? So the pro-European DS said, okay, the price is right. We get enough benefits from sending those people to The Hague, and people like Koštunica said, well, the price is not right. Or, we need...
But there was a sense of disparity of how the justice was executed. For example, you have Tudjman's policy, which was from the start, from even back in SFRJ, in Yugoslavia, he was extreme right-wing. And he was jailed in 1971 and so on. And Izetbegović wrote that Islamic declaration, and Milosevic, well, he wasn't out about his nationalism, but he grabbed the controls of powers back in the 8th session of the party. And in Croatia, after everything, no major leaders were convicted in The Hague. It was completely ethnically cleansed of Serbs, and nobody got the sense that was somehow dealt with, So the Croatia got into EU. Now they have celebrations of the day that the ethnic cleansing happened, and that's normalized. HDZ got normalized. Yes, they got more pro-European, they transformed, but still, it's the same extreme ideology and the same hatred. So similar things with Kosovo. So in Serbia, I think, and also with the NATO bombing, there was a sense of this is kind of not really fair. Because basically the framing of the wars was kind of simplifying things from the beginning. I mean, it's not as if Milosevic just attacked a sovereign country. It was a same country, and then there were a lot of Serbs in Croatia, and then it was complicated, and he used and abused this, and he was more, I think, perceived, which is a major mistake by the West, perceived as a communist in that era of anti-communist hysteria, but they didn't understand that he was actually using the nationalist and identity politics to achieve his goals.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, well, listen, I think this is part of the problem is, what is the International Criminal Tribunal was always... these courts can never be perfect. They never can really do the job properly, which national courts should do. And this is, of course, was the difficulty, that national courts nowhere did a good job, and at least not on the top level. How much and who of the Croatian leadership should have been sentenced is a tricky question. I mean, Tudjman, of course, evaded any sentence by death, and that was lucky for him, or whatever you want to call it. Milosevic, of course, evaded it in the end as well, unfortunately. No, I think it's a long debate about looking at the nuances, and I think this is what you see. The tricky thing is that in the way in which the war was conducted by Croatia, it meant that most Serbs fled because they would have been ethnically cleansed, and then once those who stayed, many of them were killed and were expelled. But these things are very tricky, and they're tricky in court, and sometimes more tricky in court than by writing history. And so it's very hard. And we saw this with the Gotovina case, where he was in the appeal released because the case was built on weak legal grounds. It doesn't mean that he's not guilty from let's say, the court of history, history writing, but that's much more complicated than a court of law. A court of law has to have the evidence for that particular thing to have done, and this made it very hard. I mean, this also made the case against Milosevic difficult, because it's not enough to show that he did what he did, that he maybe wanted to do it, but you have to have evidence. You have to really prove that did he support the army of Republika Srpska in the attack on Srebrenica. It's easy to show that, Mratko Mladić is responsible for genocide because they are he was in command of an army which was entering Srebrenica, and then afterwards, the men and boys were killed. That's fairly easy, and it gets harder the further distant these leaders are, whether it's Tudjman or Milosevic. And then courts are useful, but they're not always the best way to write history. And we don't have, I think the way history is thought about in Serbia is completely opposite from what is thought about in Croatia or in Bosnia or in Kosovo. I mean,
which is crazy, right?
Absolutely,
because it's a science. It should be science.
Well, I mean,
it shouldn't be like a nationalist narrative.
Of course, it shouldn't be a nationalist narrative. There will always be disagreements about certain things, and I think that's also part of it. You cannot have a single history. You can establish certain facts. You can establish what happened. So you can establish, for example, that in Srebrenica, 8,000 men and boys were killed who were mostly civilians, and that can be documented and all of that. But then, of course, there's a lot of interpretation, and that's what history does. It doesn't just establish facts, but it interprets those facts, right? I mean, we have a lot of debates about how did World War I break out. We had this in the 100th anniversary of the First World War with somebody like Christopher Clark, the historian, writing Sleepwalkers about, and there are other theories of which explain why the war broke out, and they're all historians, and they're not, if you're doing your job carefully, you can still come up with different interpretations. The problem is when the interpretation is not based on facts, but it serves a political agenda. So you're saying, I want to, show that Serbs are innocent, or that Serbs are guilty, or that Croats are innocent, and then of course you pick facts which prove your theory, and you ignore the facts which don't prove your theory. And that, of course, then it's a problem, because then it's not historiography, but then it's nationalist narrative.
But it's so complicated because that little decision by a court, little. I say little because it'll go far. Then it gets interpreted by nationalist historians, and then it transforms into this mythology of like in the 19th centuries when the nation states were created. So that becomes a cornerstone of this monomyth, if you want to say it in Joseph Campbell terms, like of the history of this new country. And then it's almost impossible to reverse the clock and to put the science back in history, or the facts, as you say. There will be different sources and different interpretations, but at least we should be able to agree on the facts. If you go to Potočari, I don't think anybody who has any human decency can be in doubt what happened. And of course there are people who will spin it. There are different ethics in different people, but we still have this problem with the facts, and now it's made legitimate by, for example, like normalizing what happened in Croatia, and now Croatia is a part of European Union and all is forgotten, and that history is taught in schools.
And I mean, I think when you said, Croatia is not confronting them and is in the European Union, I think the issue is that the EU is not dealing with memory of the past as an institution. The EU has no policies on how to look at the past. You can say, of course, in the history of the European Union, it coincided with Germany and France's reconciliation. But the EU is not, it's not a requirement to join the EU to be reconciled with your neighbors, or to have one historical narrative. People have written about what they call kind of a European memory narrative, but that is more a meta-narrative about World War II. It's a narrative about, fascism and the totalitarianism, which also changed after the enlargement, because before that it was much more about fascism. Once you had more conservative governments from Central and Eastern Europe joining, it was more said, well, we have to condemn and commemorate totalitarianisms, because communism and fascism are two totalitarian regimes which repressed us, which already is, you have the House of Terror in Budapest, open in the first term of Viktor Orban, and you have this story that there are two totalitarian systems which are nearly equal. Very much in the conservative commemoration culture in Central and Eastern Europe, and that in that sense very similar to the Croatian one. And this is something which is in the European debates, but even there I would say it's not unified as a memory. And then nobody says, this is how you have to remember. If Croatia was openly rehabilitating the independent state of Croatia and the NDH and the Ustaša movement, then I think that would be a taboo in the European. I mean, there's no rule, there's no EU law saying it, but it would be in the understanding of the European Union. But how Croatia commemorates, or thinks about the 90s is not something which, beyond the ICTY cooperation, is part of the EU's thinking. I mean, in Spain, the debates about Franco only began a few years ago because it was seen as a taboo, because this was part of the pact of silence after the end of the Franco regime. Nobody pushed Spain to open and to critically examine, after all, a fascist military leader, who had a monument in Spain, until not long ago. So I think there are lots of these taboos and problems in many countries which are not addressed.
And getting back to the Europe of values, and you mentioned Hungary. Yeah. So is there a way to create a system that would challenge the autocrats within the EU?
Well, it's always harder to challenge them within the EU than outside. I mean, this is what we see with Hungary, where if Hungary were a candidate country, it wouldn't join. It would have, if Hungary had not joined by the time Viktor Orban became prime minister, it would have just stagnated like Serbia has been stagnating with membership. But once it's in, it's very hard to deal with it, and mostly because there are very few methods you can use. You have a lot of you're integrated into a complicated web of institutions. So then, what you have to keep in mind, when the EU was established and the rules were set, the assumption was you are a democracy, a stable democracy, once you're an EU member state, and nobody imagined that you could become undemocratic. This was just not. This is going back to this, different era, the era of, in the Cold War period when the EU was created. But even in the 90s, people thought once you become a consolidated democracy, then there's no way back. So the logic was we have to just wait long enough for enlargement. We have to make sure that the countries after 89 who become democratic, that they become stable democracies. And once they've made that, there's no way back. They're not going to go back. So we don't have to worry about that. So the EU was never built for having an authoritarian regime among its members.
But can it be fixed now that it happened? Because my problem, I have a lot of problems and issues with Brexit. But the thing is, I think Britain could have negotiated any terms they wanted within the EU in good faith, instead of leaving the EU. So if it's an open process and policies change and rules change, maybe it's time to revisit some of the rules. I don't know how rigid the bureaucracy is.
Well, I mean, okay. I mean, there. If it's about the formal rules, we're talking about the treaties, right? And the treaties have to be ratified by every single member state, right? So, I mean, at the end, we had a European constitution, right? And it failed because the Netherlands and then France voted against it in a referendum, and that killed it. That was the end of it, right? And it would have been enough if the Netherlands had voted against it. One country is enough to change the rules. And this is why nobody is touching the rules, because they know you cannot get agreement of 27 countries. Even if Hungary, let's say if Hungary was democratic, what about Slovakia under Fico now? Or other countries, Bulgaria with no government for 5 years or whatever, a functioning government. There are plenty of other countries which might say, well, wait a minute, we don't want to become victim of that. So the problem is it's very hard to change the rules, which is, of course, also protection. It makes sure that the EU cannot impose its will on its own members easily. But it's very hard to change them. And this is really the reason. And of course, it's very hard. I mean, I would expect that if if Orban would lose power, that if there's a window of opportunity of having a basically mostly democratic and people like Fico is much more vulnerable and weaker, that then they would, and if there's an EU consensus to try to push something, that would be a moment. I mean, I would say use the opportunity to change the rules when you can before you have a new problem in the European Union. But I think this is the issue. It's very hard to change the rules in the European Union.
As a historian, okay, let's set aside the Serbian perspective. Even if we see, like, from purely pragmatical perspective, as you say, there are financial interests and local elections and stuff like that. Isn't this does this outweigh the danger of having a fascist autocrat in the heart of Europe?
Absolutely. No, I mean, this is why I've been very critical and very outspoken about this EU support for this project. I think it's a tragic mistake of the European Union. I'm trying to understand why it happens, because I usually don't believe that these things happen because there's a big conspiracy or there's a big kind of plan. I think a lot of it happens because of ignorance, because of lack of interest, lack of willingness to think through the consequences. I mean, I remember so many instances when, politicians care about the next regional election more than about the strategic long-term perspective. And there were several instances with Merkel where there was an election in, some German state, and then you have to do this and that, and you don't think about the cost of this decision. Or, Macron's blockage of EU enlargement in the talks with the veto for North Macedonia and Albania. That decision was based on French elections or EU elections, but the damage was so big, But so there's often not this strategic thinking, and this is, I think, what we're having now. I think the cost of supporting this decision is much greater than the benefits, because exactly as you're saying, what is the cost? First of all, you push people away from the European Union in the region, not just in Serbia, but also in the region, because you're saying, we care more about your materials, your raw materials, than you as human beings. This is the message, and people see that, and so the disillusionment with the EU will become much bigger. So you're basically pushing people away from the European Union, because why should you join the EU if all they want is your raw materials? If this is the perception. This is the first problem. The second problem, of course, how empowering somebody like Vučić in the region is dangerous, because he's not just happy to be a strongman in Serbia, but he has a negative influence on Bosnia, on Montenegro, on Kosovo, on North Macedonia, and every country in the region he has a negative influence. So he poisons in a certain way the whole region in many ways. So there are lots of consequences of supporting him and making him more powerful. That are very dangerous. I mean, and I think the price will be high, will be very high. So I believe that it's a costly miscalculation. I think the benefits the EU gains from this project are much smaller than the risks and the cost, not just for Serbia, or not just for Serbian citizens, but for the EU. Because in the end, if you think about if the EU had engaged earlier with Yugoslavia, I mean, I don't know if the EU could have helped keep Yugoslavia as a functioning country together, or maybe they could have helped that it dissolves without war. I don't know if the EU would have...
There was Ante Marković.
Yes, I mean, he came very late, and it was hard. I don't know if he and the EU at that time could have still helped it. But certainly, I think that, prevention is always much cheaper than dealing with the consequences of war. The EU has spent billions and billions of dealing with the consequences of war in former Yugoslavia. And I'm not saying that Vučić will lead the region to a new war like we had in the 90s, but I think that his aggressive nationalism, his authoritarianism, his complete paranoid regime which he's creating of enemies and constant threats and constant wars with neighbors, I cannot imagine that you have this campaign forever without conflict.
It's constant instability.
Exactly. If you're talking every day in the newspaper that the so-called Shqiptari or Ustaše or the Balia or Muslims and Germans and Vatican and Americans and CIA is trying to attack you. If you're saying this for 10 years, you're making war more imaginable
and people a lot crazier. Yeah. Because maybe I was too small, but I don't remember that kind of vocabulary being used even under Milošević's regime. Of course, Milošević didn't have social media and tabloids that are this crazy, but the level of disintegration of institutions in Serbia is absolutely unbelievable. Absolutely. So the courts are not working. It's like a privately owned company.
And Milošević was not in power for that long. I mean, Milošević came to power, let's say, we can say maybe in 88, so he was in power 12 years, right? So this is like as long as Vučić is now in power, right? So, but by that time it was clear he was out in 2000, and so and Vučić has years to go. I mean, or potentially years to go. So of course, the destruction of institutions is much greater because already they were weakened in Milosevic. They were not really rebuilt strong enough in the 10 years or in 12 years in between, and so the institutions were weak to begin with. Distrust in the institutions was high. Media landscape was weak. So all of this, was already made it easier for him to destroy what was there.
And people are leaving.
Yeah, exactly. The people who are asking critical questions, leave. It leaves people who believe this. I think, I was kind of like doing for transitions online. I did a little experiment or self-experiment in 2005 when Kurier was the biggest tabloid, and I read only Kurier for 2 weeks, and started to see how my,
sorry about that.
I called it, Super Size Me, like they had the movie about McDonald's diet, and I said Super Kurier Me, just following Kurier. But of course, back then this was just one of many, but now, with Informa and Srpski Telegraf and Alo and all of those, if you go crazy, and even if you don't believe 90%, even if you believe 10%, you're already in a completely parallel reality to the real world. And so this is, I think, first of all, these media are destroying your sense of reality. They're also saying that this is like Trump, there's no facts. It's all just, I say, you say, and in the end, you win even if you don't believe anything they say. But if you believe that there are no facts, there is nothing which really happens. It's all.
But it's also like complete insanity.
Yeah.
Because one day lithium is bad, other day lithium is amazing, and one day Germany is our enemy, and the other day Germany is our best friend, and like it goes on and on like some kind of bizarre social experiment. Just to see how far you can push it. Actually.
Right.
That's why I said that I don't think Vučić has a privately strong ideology. I think he's flexible, and he will adopt any means of staying to any means of staying in power. But what's the I know it's an almost impossible question. Why don't politicians listen to historians more?
I mean, all of that. I mean, well, you can also listen to many terrible historians.
But
I think
if they don't have a wider perspective or historical perspective or decades to calculate into this equation they have, then they make bad choices.
Absolutely. No, I agree. And I think the challenge we're having is that we're lacking from the EU side strategic thinking. I mean, thinking long term. And in a certain way, I always was hoping that the EU could do that more because it requires thinking among different countries which offer different perspectives. And so, it's not just German car industry, but there are other interests and other thinking, and that this as an institution is more able to think long term than somebody who is in one country. And I think this is really the big failure, is that not being able to think about the costs and the larger perspective. And I think it's reflected by the sense, it's a reflection of what I was described earlier, this kind of constant sense of crisis. And it creates an environment where people think, I just want to survive the next crisis, right? So you're thinking about crisis, and I think that becomes a trap. Because then you start thinking about, okay, I just have to manage, I'm just in crisis management, right? I cannot think about long-term strategic goals. So, now I have to manage with Ukraine and Russia. So as long as Serbia is not like becoming, fighting with Russia and as long as we're managing that, that's as good as it's going to be. And I think when you talk to a lot of European officials or, member state officials these days, this is the sense I get when I talk to them. None of them have anymore a long-term vision. They're all thinking about, okay, how do we manage this crisis? And then they're all very good at and then we talk to this guy and talk to this guy. But I think it becomes a trap when you start thinking that it's all geopolitics and it's all realpolitik and it's all crisis management. If that's your logic, then of course everything will look like a crisis, and you're kind of reproducing the system. In a certain way, it's the equivalent of what Vučić is doing within the country, right? Because he's creating an environment where everybody is constantly in panic, right? It's creating a constant sense of crisis, right? There's been no normal year in Vučić's rule, because there's either a new election coming around the corner, an early election, which shouldn't be, or there's a 10 more wars threatened against him, or there's a coup d'etat, there's a assassination attempt. There's always something. There's never normal politics. Okay, now we're going to just normally govern a country, and not this constant sense of extraordinary times. And the fact that the president is, in the media 24-hour, 27 basically, is also a sign of this abnormal. It's not. When you tell. This is. I was talking to people who monitor and who were telling foreign officials and saying how many times Vučić was on national television, and they said, "Oh, you mean in 12 years?" No, in like the last 10 months. And they're like, "What? How can it be that he's that omnipresent on television? Nearly every day."
What does he do?
Yeah, what can he?
What else
does he do? And how can you no? I was thinking which other Hugo Chavez was one of those similar presidents who was constantly on talk shows, but it's extraordinary. But I think it creates the sense of complete not normal times of crisis times, and that of course benefits those in power, and it prevents it very hard to have a strategy. And this is, of course, why it's so hard in Serbia for an opposition, because you can't build up, gradually, because you're constantly attacked by crisis and threats and all of that.
But that opposition is also still trapped in the 90s narratives. There are nobody who is going to tell the truth from the opposition. And so is Vučić ultimately now our problem to solve? Will we be treated better if we develop a backbone and show that we're an independent nation capable of dealing with at least some of our problems, and then maybe we will not be treated as a colony or as a dumping ground?
Well, first of all, Vučić was always something which Serbia and Serbian citizens have to solve, always. And nobody is ever going to solve it from the outside.
But it would be easier if the world leaders didn't support him and give money to him.
Of course, absolutely. And I think that's, again, I'm highly critical of that support he's been getting, but I think one should not neglect that the responsibility is always with citizens. Outsiders can make it worse or better, and I always say, EU leaders should be more critical. They should, at least at the public, press conferences, say something, or invite journalists who are critical to ask questions from Vučić, which are critical, which he's not used to. There was this famous visit of the Slovenian president when there was a journalist who asked a critical question to Vučić, and the president supported the journalist. So this I would like to see a lot more. That Vučić is given critical questions, which this is how elected leaders should be answering critical questions. So a lot more could be done, and definitely not this level of support we're seeing. But I think, of course, the main burden is with citizens, and it's a much harder burden with this external support. And the problem, which I often, and this is what you get as an answer when you say, well, listen, you have to support alternatives to Vučić. Doesn't mean political parties, but just alternatives. They say, well, who is there? This is what I get as answer. I say, who shall I support? Who shall we talk to? I said, it's not about individuals. It's not about he or she is the alternative to Vučić, but to say there are other voices and other opinions, and you have to talk to them. So certainly there is space. For external actors to be more critical, to give support to critical voices. To be, give them backing or some kind of, protection or so on. There's a lot more which can be done. Of course, the problem is, again, Vučić is not Milosevic. He's smart enough not to alienate the West. So, he makes sure that even before the Rio Tinto project, he made sure that, there are deals with Macron over the metro or with others, so that their economic interests, which, and he never officially buried the EU narrative. Although we know that he's not doing anything to join the European Union. When Ursula von der Leyen comes, she could always say, well, there's EU integration.
Well, after 12 years, I don't believe that.
It's a fake story, but Vučić is very smart in keeping this fake story open.
But not him. I don't believe them. I don't believe that after 12 years of Vučić, they don't understand who and what.
No, I think they understand. I mean, they understand. They understand that that's not moving forward. They might have, again, we talked about the illusions early on. I think in the first 2-3 years, they could have had this illusion. Nowadays, they cannot have this illusion anymore. Nowadays, I think they're basically, I mean, this is what colleagues and myself have called stabilitocracy. He offers them enough stability so that they can live with it. I think, when there are instances like Banska last year in Kosovo, these are moments when really this becomes dangerous for Vučić, because that, is something when it becomes too unstable and it seems to be his responsibility, then people will say, well, is he really a good deal? Is he really offering what we need? His instability can also become dangerous for him, because again, he gets a lot of support, or at least acceptance, because they say, well, at least we don't have a war, at least, we have other problems to deal with.
The thing is, like, we widen the picture, and if you see the global situation, and there were like China, a totalitarian communist state, then there is Russia, which is a failed state and practically like a clerical fascism government, mafia government. America has its own set of unique problems right now, and we don't know how will it end. And I only see Europe as the alternative to some sort of civility and common sense, and that's why I'm pushing on this issue so much. That's why I think this kind of Europe of values that we mentioned is so important, because can Europe, do you think, and maybe we could conclude with that, can Europe be independent of the United States and be its own superpower?
Well, I mean, the EU will have to be independent of the US in many ways, because the US is not the strong power it was, and also it's been dealing with issues beyond Europe. I mean, already under Obama, it said the logic was the pivot to Asia, and I think overall
banning abortions and
then there's
guns.
There's the domestic polarization of politics in America as well. But I think the US is certainly a partner for Europe, but it's a difficult partner, and the EU has to develop its own ability. Now the question is, can the EU be a value-based superpower? And that's very hard, because once you're a power as such, like which has its own interest, it can be. I believe democracies generally are more sensitive to human rights and democracy elsewhere than totalitarian states are, but it doesn't mean that they're always. America has been a democracy and has been engaged in horrific policies towards other countries because it's seen as their national interest and so on. So I think there's no guarantee.
Well, we don't have to be perfect.
No, and I think the EU, and again, I mean, the question is really what does a post-crisis Europe look like? Is Europe going to go back to a system where basic values are a consensus? I mean, this is part of the question. Is the far right in Europe does not believe in the values which the rest believes in. Doesn't believe in individual rights in the same way. It doesn't believe in the rights of migrants. Doesn't believe in diversity as something which makes for richness and so on. So there are lots of and the far right also has these authoritarian tendencies. So the question is, will Europe be able to overcome this, with Front National, with AfD, with FPÖ, with these parties which are challenging those values? I mean, so when we're talking about is the EU not able to project the values outside, it's these values are under threat from within, right? I think the problem which we're seeing is that those who are supporting those values are not saying, well, we have to fight for those values wherever we are, in the EU, outside of the EU, and our enemies are those who don't share those values. So we have to kind of make this an alliance of values and promote them. And I think instead what we're seeing is that these actors, governments, parties, become very defensive about their values, as if it's something which they have to be ashamed of, rather than saying, well, no, these values are something we should be proud of, we should aspire to that. There will be decisions which are difficult decisions. A government cannot deal with only Democrats, but it has to have a different relationship with non-Democrats. And also I say, talking to EU officials, they'll say, Serbia is not any country. It's a country which is officially aspiring to join the club. It's different than Tunisia or Egypt, which don't have that same future. Either you want the country to be in the European Union, and you say so, and that means you want the country to be democratic, rule of law based, or you don't want it to be in the European Union, and then you don't care how it's governed. But you can't do both. You can't say, I care how it's governed, I care about, because it's a future, we're going to be sitting on a table in Brussels together and deciding about our money and our rules, but then you can't support Vučić. You can't do both. So you have to decide to some degree. And I think this is where I think the EU and many of its leaders could be more courageous. I hope they will become more courageous again. But again, the EU is as good or as bad as the sum of its citizens, its elected politicians. So I think it can become better again. It doesn't have to be. It could also get worse. I'm not. The only thing which is a safeguard is the EU cannot be captured by one person. Unlike the US by Trump or China or Russia, they can be captured by one person. The EU, because it's so complicated, has the weakness that it's hard to deal with Hungary or so on, but it has that also as a strength that it cannot be hijacked by one strong leader, because then countries will leave. And so that is also a little checks and balances of the system, which has its good sides. But it makes it so much harder to move in a different direction, right? So, again, I hope that the EU in 10 years or so will become a more value-based union again, also in its policies towards non-members. But I think it, to some degree, has to first regain confidence in those values and regain the self-assuredness that those values are worth fighting for within the EU and then also towards other countries.
Well, thanks. That's basically what we have to do in Serbia as well.
Indeed. And that's, I think, the issue, is to see these as allies, to see people who have to fight these battles in Serbia with allies and those in the European Union, where we have to fight these battles against the far-right parties, which are threatening, exactly in the same way. Those guys are working together. They see each other as allies. Orban, Vučić, FPÖ in Austria, they see each other...
They're on speed dial.
Yeah, they see each other as being, kindred brothers, but we have to see in a certain way how to work together to stop this threat of democracy. But there are not enough alliances really.
But Europe is a union of mostly pluralist countries with vastly different opinions, and I sincerely hope that there is a lot more of us than of them. They might be more vocal.
Exactly. They shout louder,
yes,
and they claim to speak on the behalf of everybody. But if at the end of the day, they don't get majorities. Or if they get a majority at one point, it's very narrow, it's very tight, and it's mostly based on the passivity of the others. So that makes me optimistic.